Did a little research this week, believe that or not, on the word difficult. And I tried to find some synonyms for the word difficult. I found what I was looking for. But you know what I didn't find as one of those synonyms? I did not find the word impossible. Now, I'm afraid that we have taken the viewpoint that if something is difficult, it just must be impossible. And if it's impossible, why even try? Right? You know, I think what people mean when they say that something is impossible, what they mean is I don't understand it. How do you feel about the book of Daniel? Oh, it's impossible. No, it's not. It may be difficult, but it's not impossible. And many times we've taken the viewpoint that it's just too hard. I'm too old, I'm too dumb, I'm too whatever, and I can't understand this. When what you mean is, I'm lazy, and I don't want to put forth the effort that this is obviously going to require me to put into it. Now that's what we mean. Think about it. If we say something is too hard, why is it too hard? It's because we understand this is going to take more than 5 minutes worth of my time. And I don't know if I have 6 minutes to spare. So let's talk about the book of Daniel. You ready to talk about the book of Daniel? Because we already started last week. We're going to continue this week with our prologue to Daniel. This will just simply be part 2. Last week we talked about some important people from the book of Daniel. And I know now that you know who Nebuchadnezzar is, and Jehoiakim, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, along with Belteshazzar and Belshazzar. So we did that so clear last week that it's just clear as a bell, isn't it? Clear as crystal. But we also talked about some important nations. Now you know Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, you know the Greeks, you know the Romans. And of course you still know the tribe of Judah, as it were, the southern kingdom of Judah, who's in Babylonian captivity throughout the book of Daniel. Now, I know that you already knew all that before last week, but we just refreshed our memory as to what the book of Daniel, at least those aspects, are all about. So we're going to pick up in that same vein, and there's 3 things that we're going to do tonight. Number 1, we're going to talk about the time. By that we mean the time frame of the book of Daniel, at least generally speaking. Daniel was a predictive prophet, and some of his prophecies went way on ahead past his time, but we'll talk about some of that. Second, we're going to talk about the text, and we're going to give a brief survey of each chapter of Daniel in chronological order. More fun, isn't it? And then third, we're going to give 2 quick lessons that we can apply to our present day lives. So that's what we intend to do. Now let's begin. Believe it or not, we're not going to start in the book of Daniel. Go figure. Because let's give a brief overview of Old Testament time. In the first place, as we talk about the time of the book of Daniel, let's talk broadly about the Old Testament for just a second. In the Scriptures, time was recognized by important events and rulers on respective thrones. Look with me in 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, believe it or not, is actually a rather important verse in the Old Testament, especially regarding the aspect of time. 1 Kings 6 and verse 1 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that is to the Jews, especially of that time, that he began to build the house of the Lord." Now, believe it or not, that's pretty specific. That means if we can give a pretty good time frame on when Solomon reigned, we can go back to when the Exodus from Egypt was. So broadly speaking, round numbers, though you could probably tighten it up a little bit better than this, that's approximately 970 BC. Add 480 to that, what do you have? The Exodus was approximately, though you could tighten that up a few years, in 1450 BC. Now, you can even go back from that if you so choose and be close to the age of the earth. But that's not the purpose of this sermon, because we know Adam was the first man, but we've done that in days gone by and we won't do it now. But going from that basis, that approximately speaking, the Exodus was in 1450 BC. 1 Kings 6:1 takes place in approximately 970 BC. Now, let's look ahead to 1 Kings 11 and verse 42. And we're not going to do all things like this, but to give an idea as to how we come up with such and such date BC, here's one way that happens. By the reigns of these kings and by the important events that occurred in Old Testament history. 1 Kings 11 and verse 42, and the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. So if that was the 4th year of Solomon's reign in 970 BC, he took the throne at about 974 BC, and then as we see his son Rehoboam would have began to reign in approximately 934 BC. I think you get the idea, okay? And we're not going to go through by this king, this event, that event, but that is the broad aspect by important events and then by the reigns of respective rulers on their thrones. Now, let's get a brief overview of Israel and Judah. The tribes of Israel were united as a kingdom for a period of approximately 120 years. How do you come up with that? Saul was the first king and he reigned for 40 years. David was the second king over united Israel and he reigned for approximately 40 years. And then Solomon was the third king, and we read it plainly from the text, that he reigned for 40 years. 40, 40, 40, even by my pitiful math skills. I believe that's 120, isn't it? I believe that it is. Now, what you see in 1 Kings 12 is the kingdom dividing. Basically, the 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel had all of 0 good kings and went into Assyrian captivity in approximately 722 BC, from which they never recovered, listen carefully, as a kingdom. Those people were not eradicated in that captivity. Ultimately, they were absorbed into Judah. Judah was basically the 2 tribes which encompassed some of the Levites at least, and the faithful that realized this is wrong. This is wrong. So Judah, from one aspect, was just 2 tribes, really 3, but it did encompass all the faithful who left the northern kingdom of Israel. But guess what? As the northern kingdom was given to sinfulness, primarily idolatry, the southern kingdom of Judah stayed faithful a little longer. They had a few good kings, but ultimately they went into Babylonian captivity in 3 waves. 606 BC, 597 BC, 586 BC. That's a brief overview of the time of Old Testament and of Israel and Judah. I think you've heard all that pretty much before. Now let's go to the book of Daniel, and let's see how the book of Daniel begins. And with all the foundation that we've laid very briefly, let's see if we can come up with an accurate date as to when the book of Daniel begins. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, remember last week his birth name was Eliakim? The 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. So based on earlier calculations, this would be 606 BC. So Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1 takes place approximately. That means it's pretty close. In fact, I've never been able to find anything other than 605 BC. So pick one, 606 or 605. That is generally what everyone, based on those other calculations, has come up with the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So Daniel picks up at approximately 606 BC. with the first wave of Babylonian captivity. Now look in this same chapter, but look at the last verse. Daniel 1 and verse 21. Daniel 1 and verse 21 says, "And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus." Now you know who King Cyrus is. Isaiah recorded some things about this man in Isaiah chapters 44 and 45, where the Lord called Cyrus by name no less than 150 years before he was born. Something, according to Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, stirred up the spirit of Cyrus so that he recognized, I need, since the Medes and the Persians have now conquered Babylon. Remember Daniel's vision? We'll talk more about that in a minute. Something stirred him up to release, turn those Jews loose and let them go back. Do you remember this? Because it seems that by this time an older man, probably at least in his 80s, by the name of Daniel, said, come here, read this. That's talking about you. And he said, wow. And something at least stirred up the spirit of Cyrus to turn those Jews loose from Babylonian captivity. All that being said, Jeremiah the prophet prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 12 and Jeremiah 29 and verse 10 that Judah would spend 70 years in Babylonian captivity. Now, with that being said, what do you think the first year of King Cyrus would be? Since we began at 606, subtract 70 and guess what you come up with? 536 BC. So there is no doubt at all, really whatsoever, that the book of Daniel, even from the first chapter, covers a period of no less than 70 years. Now that's a tremendous amount of time from our perspective, is it not? But guess what else? Daniel was a predictive prophet. Now what do you mean by a predictive prophet? That means he was a foreteller, F-O-R-E. Not only did Daniel F-O-R-T-H tell, he foretold what would happen really in world history. Now how did he do that? People say that's what Nostradamus was. Nostradamus was not anywhere even close to Daniel. Not even close. So perhaps one of the reasons, if not the main reason, that Daniel, the book of Daniel, is so challenging is because of the element of predictive prophecy. Daniel told about things that were going to happen long before they came to happen. Here's what makes the book of Daniel even more challenging. You can see it begins with Babylon in control. But you also see that King Cyrus of the Medes and the Persians is in control before the end of the first chapter, as it were, historically speaking. But Daniel also prophesies about some things that happen between the testaments. Now think about Daniel, or Nebuchadnezzar's vision that Daniel tells him and then explains him the meaning. You remember the head of gold? That's Babylon. The arms and the chest or breast, as it were, of silver? That's the Medo-Persians. Then you have the belly and thighs of brass. That's the Greeks. And then you have the legs of iron and the feet of part of iron and part of clay. That's the Roman Empire. Think about this. Before the Old Testament ends, you can see that the Persians have overtaken Babylon. But then when you read the New Testament, who's in control? Rome. Well, there was another period of time there, wasn't there, where the Greeks ruled the world. So Daniel speaks of some of that time that happened between the testaments. And that's what makes things, in essence, so difficult. There's a brief aspect of the time. Now let's get to the meat. Let's talk about the text. Let's give a brief survey of each chapter of Daniel in chronological order. Yes. Now, believe it or not, most books of the Old Testament, known as the major prophets, are not in chronological order. Well, why are they in the order that they gave them? All right, you prepare yourself. I don't know. You ready for that? I don't know. That's just the way that they're given. But now let me prove to you simply, very quickly and very easily, that the book of Daniel is not in chronological order. Look at chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, and let's look at verse 30. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 30. In that night was Belshazzar. Now you know who Belshazzar is. This is most likely the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Says his father, son, but it was probably not like Logan is my son. It was probably meaning a descendant, most likely his grandson. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans. Remember the Chaldeans, ruling class Babylonians? Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain. Now what happened in chapter 5 and verse 30 with Belshazzar? He dead. He dies. Well, look at chapter 7 and verse 1. in the first year of Belshazzar. Now, wait a minute. How can he die in chapter 5 and verse 30, and then chapter 7 starts speaking of the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon? Now, unlike the individuals known as Darius, there is no historical record of any other person named Belshazzar. So what does that tell you? Chronologically speaking, chapter 7 has to come before chapter 5. Do you understand that? But then look at chapter 8. In the third year, and verse 1 rather, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar. Now wait a minute. What happened in chapter 5 and verse 30? He died. Now what is the clear and obvious meaning? Chapter 7 and chapter 8 come before chapter 5, chronologically speaking. Pooh, mind blown. Now, let's get a brief overview of each of these chapters. Believe it or not, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 seem to be in chronological order, so let's start at chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, you see Daniel and his friends in captivity. And despite being in captivity, Daniel held to his integrity and was blessed. Look at Daniel 1 and verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Perhaps they were unclean, according to the law of Moses. Remember what we talked about, Daniel? Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So Daniel's going to hold fast to his integrity. Now you think, oh, here's a Hebrew youth in captivity. He's going to just get killed right off the bat. Look at verse 15. And at the end of 10 days there, that's Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know the other three generally as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But at the end of 10 days their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat a portion of the king's meat. What's the lesson? Don't compromise your integrity for anyone at any time over anything, ever. Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of the kingdom. Perhaps most of us at least are more familiar with this chapter than some others. Look at Daniel 2 and verse 1. And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, remember him, king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans. These were the wise men, at least the ruling class Babylonians, the Chaldeans were, for to show the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. Now, look at Daniel 2 and verse 4. I'll tell you a little interesting side note. From the end part of Daniel 2 and verse 4, all the way through the end of chapter 7 is written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So that could be some of the reason why the book of Daniel is laid out in the order that it is. You can look that up on your own, just FYI. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show thee the interpretation. The king, verse 5, that's Nebuchadnezzar, answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, I like this, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. You reckon that'd straighten up the false teachers today? You want to get up and say something, if you can't prove it with the scriptures, we're going to cut you in pieces. Reckon what they'd say then. Well, anyway, we'll play nice. Now, look at verse 10. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. They said, nobody can tell you what you dreamed and then tell you what the dream means. There's nobody that can do it. Well, you reckon they were right or wrong about that? They were wrong, because we know, and we don't even really have to read on, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar the dream and tells him the interpretation of the dream. How do you reckon he did that? He was inspired by God. Daniel chapter 3 is about the fiery furnace. You ever thought about the fact that idolatry is sinful? What if it came from the king, from the ruler of the land, that at a certain time when certain things happen, you bow down and worship this great image? You say, well, I'm not going to do that. Say, fine. You have the right not to do that. But if you don't, we're going to throw you alive into a burning fiery furnace. What do you think? Think about it, brethren. Think about it, brethren. What if that happened today? We'd say, oh, I'll hold fast. Yeah, we might. But then again, we might say, oh, it won't hurt anything too bad. It's sinful to practice idolatry. Daniel 3 and verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits. That's about a cubit right there, roughly speaking, from your elbow to the tip of your finger. Imagine 60 of those. Boys, that's a great big old image, isn't it? That's a great big old thing. Look at it. Whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Look at verse 4. Then an herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship. Worship what? The golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And, verse 6, whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning, fiery furnace. Now, look at verse 12. You know this, we're just hitting it quick. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. You know what happens? They get thrown into the furnace, and what happens? They didn't burn up, did they? They were supernaturally protected by God. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is going to eat like an ox. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream with a different meaning. For the sake of time, look at Daniel chapter 4 and verse 29. At the end of 12 months, he, this is Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. Verse 30, the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built? Now watch, there's his problem. For the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty. Whoop. He's going to have to go eat grass for a little while till he can come back to his senses and realize that God rules in the kingdoms of men and setteth it up over whomsoever he will. Look at verse 33, same chapter. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men and did eat grass as oxen. The king of kings at that time, what happens? He's out living like an animal. You reckon that's humbling to a man? You ever gone outside and ate grass like an ox? Why, I'm sure you have not. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. That is amazing. We'll talk more about that in the weeks to come. Guess what chapter is next? You say chapter 5. Oh no, there's a problem with that. We need to go now. You need to learn how to count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 11, 10, 12, 9. When you deal with the book of Daniel, that's the way you need to learn how to count now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 11, 10, 12, 9. You know how many times I got tested on that? I'm going to test you the same way. So where are we going? We're going to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7 in many ways is parallel with Daniel chapter 2. Now in Daniel chapter 7, which is about 4 beasts, Daniel has a vision which expands upon the earlier dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Look at Daniel chapter 7 beginning in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson most likely, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream. There's pretty good indication as to who the inspired writer of the book of Daniel is, isn't it? Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the manners. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. And we're just going to look at the first part of these next verses. The first was like a lion. That's Babylon. That's equal to the head of gold of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Verse 5, and behold another beast, a second, like to a bear. That's the Medo-Persian Empire, equal to the chest and arms of silver of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of chapter 2. Verse 6, After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard. That's equal to Greece, the belly and thighs of brass in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. Shot in the dark. That's Rome, equal to the legs of iron and the feet of iron and part of iron and clay. Isn't that amazing? Now, next is Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8 is about the ram and the goat. Daniel has another vision, and parts of this vision are explained. Now, look at Daniel chapter 8, beginning in verse 3. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. The Medes and the Persians, just saying. Verse 4, I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. Why not eastward? Because the Medes and the Persians, from the aspect of Palestine, came from the east. Doesn't that make sense? That's not that hard, is it? So that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And verse 5, as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west. You know your Bible geography? You should. Came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground, showing the swiftness that the Grecian armies came, like a leopard in chapter 7. Touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Now you say, how do you know all this? Look at verse 20 and 21 of the same chapter. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Now you listen, you cut on the TV late at night and you see if people read that far into the text. It tells you what it is, isn't it? And verse 21, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, or Greece. Now there's an inspired explanation of Daniel's vision. What else do you need? Well, guess what's next? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5. We learn how to count. We can't do nothing else, right? Right. Stay with me. Daniel chapter 5 is about the writing on the wall. You ever been scared to death? You ever wonder where the expression scared to death comes from? I wonder if it doesn't come from this. Look at Daniel chapter 5, verse number 4 beginning. They drank wine. I can give a lesson right there. There's always trouble when you start drinking fermented wine. Watch. They drank wine and praised the gods, the false gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. In the same hour, verse 5, came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king, now this is Belshazzar, probably Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed. You know what countenance has to do with? Your face. Your face. That means his face changed. He may have been having a good time. When he saw those fingers over there writing on the wall, it wasn't funny anymore. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. He was knee-knocking scared. I reckon you could say, that's scared to death. We'll talk about that later. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6. Chapter 6 of Daniel is about Daniel in the lion's den. We're perhaps a little bit more familiar with this. Daniel was a great man. You don't have to read too awful far throughout the book of Daniel to see how Daniel is highly favored by men and individuals, I should say, everywhere. Daniel 6 and verse 4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. That means they were wanting to accuse Daniel of wrongdoing. But they could find, what could they find? They were trying to find something wrong with him. They could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Boy, you know you're right when the fault finders can't say anything against you, right? Verse 5. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Where are the men like this today? Don't we need some Daniels in the Lexington Church of Christ? I believe that we do. Verse number 7, for the sake of time, you do this or don't do this, you're going to be cast into the den of lions. Verse 8, you see the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Do you remember the lesson from last week? What did the Medes and Persians offer to the gospel? When something was put in writing, nobody changed it. What's the New Testament? It's a written law. Who has the authority to change it? No one. Now, verse number 10. Watch this. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day. Oh, no, Daniel, you can't do this. And prayed and gave thanks before his God. You know what impresses me about the whole ordeal? Is the last few words, as he did aforetime. It ain't changing him. Daniel knew what was right. Hey, you going to cast me in the lion's den? Fine, I'm going to do what I ever did anyway. It wasn't, he said, oh, now I'm going to stand up for the Lord. He had been doing that really his whole life in Babylonian captivity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6. You'd say 7's next, but it's not. Now we go to chapter 11, and we'll explain these things as we go. Chapter 11 is about the king of the north. This is a difficult chapter of the Bible. I would say, and I've been wrong before and I'll be wrong again, you have never heard a sermon from Daniel chapter 11. You know why that is? Because it is exceedingly difficult. Most likely the things that occur in Daniel chapter 11 occurred between the testaments, where there is no written, inspired revelation from God. But history does speak about a lot of things, so a working knowledge of various aspects of history really helps when reading the book of Daniel. Look at Daniel chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. And the king of the south. Now, keep in mind, with regard to these directions, they're generally from Palestine. It may as well even say Jerusalem. Well, if I were to ask you what major nation is south of Jerusalem, I would hope you'd say Egypt. Wouldn't you think? So most likely the king of the south is referring to Egypt, but we'll flesh that out as we go. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. Now, who's the king of the north? It seems, and we'll flesh it out more when we get there, this is probably talking about Greece, yet again. The king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. What's next? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 11, 10. Daniel chapter 10 is about the man in linen. Regardless of the exact identity of the man in linen, he definitely told the truth. Look at Daniel 10 beginning in verse 4. Some may say that the man in linen is Jesus. Well, let's see if there's anything where they could get that. I'm not saying it is, but just listen. Daniel 10 and verse 4. And in the 24th day of the first month, I was by the great river, by the side, that is, of the great river, which is Hiddekel. You all know now that that's the Tigris River. Then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. Verse 6, his body also was like the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. We'll talk more about that moving forward, but I wanted to show you something else in this chapter. Look at verse 10. And behold, an hand touched me, which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands, and he said unto me, O Daniel, a man greatly beloved. That seems to even be heaven's perception of Daniel. Understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. Then said he unto me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, look at this. Tell me this isn't some encouragement. Thy words were heard. You ever wonder if God really hears? Daniel may have wondered, but what's he getting some confirmation here? We heard you, buddy. Lord heard you. Thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. Chapter 12 is next. Chapter 12 is about the time of trouble. Look at Daniel 12 and verse 1. I am convinced that the time of trouble is equal to Matthew 24 and verse 21. Then shall be great tribulation. So Daniel is talking about some things that are literally, from Daniel's perspective, hundreds of years in the future. Daniel 12 and verse 1, and at that time shall Michael, we'll talk about him, stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation even to that time, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Mark in your mind Matthew 24, 21, and see if they're not at least somewhat parallel. Chapter 9 is how the book ends. Chapter 9 is about the 70 weeks. Now, not everything in Daniel chapter 9 is exceedingly difficult, but some of the things in Daniel chapter 9 are very difficult. But I want you to look at this in Daniel 9 and verse 26. Don't miss this, okay? Daniel 9 and verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah. You know who the Messiah is. That's Jesus. Shall Messiah be cut off. Now understand this about the Messiah. He died. Why did he die? Isaiah 53:8. He shall be cut off out of the land of the living for the transgressions of my people was he stricken. So though there are some difficult things in Daniel chapter 9, understand this, that the death of Christ was not an accident. It was well planned, and it happened, according to Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of the time. Right exactly when God said that everything was ready, it happened. 2 quick lessons. Number 3. Number 1 is doom. Every great nation that has ever been has eventually fallen. Do you know why the Babylonians fell? Well, you could say it was for the will of God. Well, that's true. But why? Sin. What happened to the Medes and the Persians? They fell. Why'd they fall? Sin. What happened to the Greeks? Alexander the Great conquered the whole world before he was 30 years old. Said, there's nothing else I can do. Why did the Grecian kingdom fall? Sin. What about the great Roman Empire? Going to go on forever. Where are they? They fell. What's the lesson? Every group of people that continually lives in sin, you're not going to make it. You know what's going to ultimately happen to the dirt, the place that we're standing on right now? We're going to keep playing around as a nation, living and abiding in sin, and somebody's going to throw us down. And generally, it's not just going to be, oh, peace, 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 peace. It's going to be bloody and it's going to be violent. You know the solution? Get right and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, because here's the second lesson. It's deliverance. You know why Daniel did as well as he did? Because he lived faithfully to God. Do you know how Daniel kept prospering in the midst of these heathen? Because he didn't go along to get along. He stood for the truth of God's word, and what happened? God blessed him right there where he was. Thanks to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, we can be delivered from the eternal doom of hellfire. We don't have to burn in hell. Thanks to Jesus. But you know what? He's given us a part to play in this process too. We have to take the responsibility to realize what we've done wrong and find out what the Lord has told us to do to make it right, and do it. And stop tearing around. The New Testament tells us very clearly what we must do to be saved. And it's up to us whether or not we're going to obey it from the heart. Romans 6:23 is very clear. For the wages of sin is death. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. What must I do to be saved? Hear the truth. Acts 18:8. Believe the truth. John 8:24. Repent of sin. Acts 3:19. Confess Jesus Christ to be the Son of God. Romans 10:9 and 10. Be immersed in water for the remission of sins, so that the blood of Christ will wash away your sins, and that the Lord will add you to His church, the church of Christ. Acts 2:38, Acts 22:16, Acts 2:47. And brethren, we got to be faithful. No matter what the heathen about us are doing, we do what God's Word says. Revelation 2:10. Come now, as together we stand and as we sing the song of encouragement.